Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In our previous lecture, we talked about the early phases of the French Indochina War, and at the end of that lecture, mentioned that momentum had shifted in favor of the Viet Minh. In this lecture, we'll talk about the continuing frustrations of the French and their failure to prevail in this war, and ultimately, the victory of the Vietnamese. During 1948, the Viet Minh Army nearly doubled in size, and as I mentioned in the previous lecture, frustration with French actions were only contributing to the growing momentum behind the Viet Minh. In March of 1949, the French persuaded Bao Dai to head a new government in the South, which they called a, quote, associated state within the French Union. They declared Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia independent, and claimed to not be fighting a colonial war at all, but rather supporting the nationalist faction in a civil war. But the Vietnamese people were not convinced. The new government did not have any real sovereignty and was still dominated by the French. Also, in 1949, Communist Mao was victorious in China, which I'll discuss in a future lecture. In January of 1950, the new Chinese government extended both military assistance and diplomatic recognition to Ho Chi Minh's government, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Moscow also recognized the DRV that same year. At this point, Ho dropped the non-communist front of his party and became openly communist. Some purging of the non-communist elements of the Viet Minh then followed, but it didn't weaken. The Communist Party was re-established as the Lao Dong, the Workers' Party. By the end of 1950, thanks largely to contributions from the Chinese, the so-called Barefoot Army was now transformed into a well-disciplined, well-armed machine, and many of the advantages that the French had once held had now evaporated. In 1951, the Lao Dong began land reform programs in the countryside, confiscating lands from the landlords and distributing it to the peasants. These popular programs encouraged even more Vietnamese to join the Viet Minh effort and further strengthened the army. In the meantime, French efforts were sagging. The war was growing increasingly unpopular back in France. With support for the war flagging, the French government discontinued the draft and began to reduce troop counts. This was a nation that had been at war for more than a decade straight and had been badly beaten during World War II. Another defeat was more than the nation could stand. In late 1950, General Giap began an aggressive offensive campaign against a string of French garrisons in the northern countryside. One fell after the other. The French losses were heavy, and at each garrison they abandoned stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, supplies, and foodstuffs. By the end of that year, the French were driven back into the large cities and the coastline. The momentum of the war had now swung fully behind the Viet Minh, and they prepared to launch major attacks into the Red River Delta. French morale sagged. The French held out one last shred of hope that somehow assistance from the Americans might support their war effort. I'll be talking in a future lecture about how and why the United States got directly involved. For now, it's enough to understand that the United States in this period was supporting the French effort. It was just a matter of how much support they would send. In the summer of 1950, the first American aid package for the French was implemented, and a group called the Military Assistance and Advisory Group, or MAG, M-A-A-G, was sent. They coordinated the aid sent and trained the French in weapons and tactics. At the same time, the United States initiated a program of economic and technical assistance for the Bao Dai government. United States aid increased in 1951 and 52 in propping up the French war effort, as the French contributions themselves declined. By the end of the Truman administration in early 1953, the United States had sent more than $1 billion in aid to the French war effort. It's worth noting again that the French had predicted a quick victory in this war, and so United States aid sent in this early period seemed to be well-founded. This is also at the same time as the Korean War, and both of these efforts were seen as the frontline effort in holding back communism. And again, I'll talk much more about this in a future lecture. Even with this enormous American aid, the French were not able to turn the tide of the war. To crush this kind of guerrilla army requires both a great military advantage and popular support. The French had neither. The Americans were unable to convince the French to step up their own efforts because the French held the trump card. They could simply withdraw from Vietnam and leave it to the communists, an outcome that was unacceptable to the Americans. It is this initial support of the French effort that began to rope the United States into a deep commitment in Indochina. Gradually, over a succession of presidents, the American commitment escalated. Truman's decision to support the French war effort, Eisenhower's decision to intervene and ultimately replace the French, Kennedy, who escalated the effort and began a small-scale secret war in Vietnam, and ultimately Lyndon Johnson in July 1965 and his decision to fight a major war in Vietnam. These decisions had long-term effects, and we'll talk about them in great detail as the course goes on. But they were typically made in response to immediate problems. Each step of the escalation resulted from an immediate event but proved impossible to undo. This was short-term thinking, without considering the long-term effects. There were also political concerns at work. Each president worried that immediate withdrawal might cause severe political damage to their party and themselves at home. And there was also the, at the time, perceived real threat of the domino theory that prevailed over all diplomacy during this period. None of these presidents wanted to be the one responsible for losing that first domino, especially after we lost China in 1949. Finally, these presidents rarely sought the advice of Congress. They made little effort to understand Ho Chi Minh or the true objectives of the Vietnamese. They ignored the fact that there were no obvious connections between Vietnam and Moscow. They could not see the situation in Vietnam as a localized event. It was always viewed in the broader Cold War context. In the meantime, the situation for the French was growing worse. The defeats of 1950 left the French with few options. They could either dramatically increase their war effort, or they could attempt to negotiate a settlement, or they could perhaps try something different. And as we'll see, I think there's some effort at each of these three options. General Giap, in the meantime, decided that the war had reached its third stage, in which the Viet Minh would go on the offensive. In early 1951, he abandoned small-scale guerrilla warfare and launched a series of human wave attacks, full frontal assaults against French positions. The French, while usually outnumbered in these engagements, used artillery and air attacks to inflict massive casualties. In June of 1951, having suffered more than 15,000 casualties in these attacks, Giap called off the offensive. Still, the overall situation remained unchanged. The Viet Minh was growing in strength, and French commitment to the war was losing ground. Giap continued to launch sporadic attacks against the French, probing for weaknesses and then retreating to their mountain hideouts. They kept the pressure on the French while avoiding major casualties, as in the earlier campaign. During this period, the most significant confrontation occurred at Hoa Binh between November 1951 and February 1952. Hoa Binh was a town about 50 miles west of Hanoi that lay on a major road in the hills, held by the French. Giap gradually committed more and more troops to the battle, wearing down the French position in a sort of half-siege. Ironically, both sides were armed with similar U.S.-made weapons. The French obtained them in the U.S. aid program. The Vietnamese got most of their weapons through theft and capture, others via the Chinese, and a few lingering from American support during World War II, which I discussed in an earlier lecture. In February 1952, the French were forced to withdraw from Hoa Binh, a major victory for the Viet Minh, whose control now extended that much closer to Hanoi. This was one of the last major towns before Hanoi itself, so now Viet Minh recruitment efforts reached almost to the giant capital city. By the end of 1952, in a conflict that had now stretched on for nearly 6 years, there were more than 90,000 French casualties, and the French were growing exhausted by this war. It became evident that an anti-war settlement was on the horizon. In April of 1953, General Henri Navarre assumed command of the French forces in Indochina. He was ordered to win the war, but faced an impossible task. The French were now outmanned by the Viet Minh, and the disparity grew worse by the day. The Viet Minh army now numbered in excess of 350,000 troops. French morale was reaching an all-time low. The French army confronted similar questions that would later be confronted by Americans. They questioned the purpose of the war and didn't know what they were fighting for. The Bao Dai government they were supposedly defending did not inspire them, and opposition on the home front was widespread. Politicians and the media were calling for some kind of settlement. Navarre decided to launch a series of offensives aimed at two objectives: either to somehow win the war outright and force the Viet Minh to surrender, or at least to dramatically change the situation as they attempted to reach a settlement with the Vietnamese. The result of this offensive would be the final battle of the French Indochina War, the battle at Dien Bien Phu, which we'll discuss in the next lecture.